Well, good evening, and we are going to go through a lot of information that's dealing with the just war theory. And in this presentation, I'll be giving a short historical basis for the just war theory. I'll be describing each of the principles, giving examples, and showing the scriptural support for each of those. And probably it'll be on Thursday, complete this, and then get into certain issues that are affecting the just war theory. Now, war is both defensive or offensive, depending on which side you're on. It's a contest between nations or states carried on by force, either for defense or for revenging insults and redressing wrongs, for the extension of commerce or acquisition of territory, or for obtaining and establishing the superiority and dominion of one over the other. These objects are accomplished by the slaughter or capture of troops, by the capture and destruction of ships, towns, and property. Among rude nations, war is often waged and carried on for plunder. Now, this comes from Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary, and that's considered a Christian or biblical-based dictionary. Development of the just war theory, it started approximately, was that 1700 years ago? It came into being during the Middle Ages, between 476 and 1500 AD. The theory provides principles for considering when to apply the use of force by responsible government. That's called jus ad bellum, and how to apply that force properly, jus in bello. Its roots are from both the Old Testament of ancient Israel and classical Greek and Roman political thought. The Christian war concept first appeared in the thought of Augustine in Hippo in his City of God in the early 5th century. Now we find just war theories as distinct streams in Catholic canon law and theology, Protestant religious thought, secular philosophy, international law, military theory and practice, and the experience of statecraft. Thus, we find examples of the just war tradition in the law of nations and in positive international law. We have a form of this tradition in modern military codes and rules of engagement. Two of the most important theorists of just war over the past 40 years have been the Protestant theologian Paul Ramsey and the political philosopher Welzer. Okay, we start off with God's design for social order, his sovereign spheres. And this is based on Western civilization, which is part of that Greek and Roman history, Old Testament and New Testament. And our whole concept is based on the laws of nature and nature's God. And this concept of laws of nature, nature's God, controls each of these sovereign spheres. It begins with the individual as his ability of self-government, which is based on faith, virtue, truth, and liberty. Basically, it's based on the individual and a biblical worldview. Now, this individual and biblical worldview, with everything working properly, is found in every single one of these sovereign spheres. And this is what sustains Western civilization. It's the individual doing his particular job based on a biblical worldview as he is working in each of these separate spheres. Each of these spheres is sovereign, meaning they have their own form of government. so that the marriage and family is to procreate and educate. The church is to unify moral principles within the social order. You have commerce, which is to grow national and personal wealth. We rely on neighbors and community to nourish our personalities and protect a certain external, give us a sense of protection from external power and caprice. And then we're looking at the organic laws of the United States. These are to protect our negative or unalienable rights and restrain evil. That's where the just war theory comes in, is to protect our unalienable rights based on a biblical worldview. So just war theory, and like I said, I'm going to go through very quickly. And I'm basing my presentation off of this website here, which is Capital Ministries. And it's the Bible on when just war is justifiable. And it's a two-part study. We're going to look at part 1 and later on part 2. But I highly recommend that you write this site down and refer to it, because we're going to be going through very quickly. And you're going to need this site to refresh and dig a little deeper into each of the topics. But for the just war theory, the principles for a justifiable war, there are 8 of them. And it's just cause, a competent authority, comparative justification, right intention, a last resort, probability of success, proportionality of results, and the right spirit. Now, looking at each of the principles, we first look at just cause. This is the reason for engaging in war morally right, or is the reason for engaging in war morally right, such as defending a nation from an evil aggressor. The war criteria of just cause means that in some overt way, a nation's sovereignty is directly threatened. Just cause is the first principle for a nation to consider when pondering the use of war. A direct threat to a nation need be imminent to warrant the use of war. Revelation 19:11 helps support this first principle. And then I saw in heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. So here we're looking at the Jesus Christ proclaiming war for righteousness. And that's exactly what the just cause is. It's going to be based on righteousness. An example is the Barbary states, nominally subject to the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is a few hundred years ago, were essentially free to do as they wished, so long as they paid their annual tributes to the rulers in Istanbul. The states lived on the states of the Barbary coast lived on piracy. They had seized the ships of American colonists as early as the 1640s, preparing to negotiate the usual treaty to set the rate of the annual tribute. Jefferson and Adams asked the ambassador about the grounds of their pretensions to make war upon nations who had done them no injury. The ambassador answered that it was written in their Quran that all nations which had not acknowledged the Prophet Muhammad were sinners, whom it was the right and duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave. So this provided a just cause to battle against the Muslims on the Barbary coast, and we did that by invading Tripoli. Jefferson sent Marines into Tripoli to stop this and Out of that came the Treaty of Tripoli, and that was in the early 1800s. Principle number 2 is competent authority. This next principle asks this question: has the aggression that a nation is responding to been declared and or proliferated by the actual authority within the nation? It is not just for a nation to declare war on another nation that is not responsible for the evil actions being propagated with its own geographical boundaries. And here, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Basically, what this is saying is that this establishes the legal authority of a state, which is the emperor or the supreme or governors. And these are the ones that we would be responding to if we were invaded, if it was a state or a nation. But I'll give you a couple examples here where it's not. Okay, the first example is of legal civil authority declaring war. And this is Japan declares war, December 7th, 1941. So we, by the grace of heaven, Emperor of Japan, seated on the throne of a line unbroken for ages eternal, enjoin upon ye, our loyal and brave subjects. We hereby declare war on the United States of America and the British Empire. So this is where a nation, a state, which is duly authorized, governmental power within Japan, has declared war on the United States and Great Britain. So this has justified the United States in declaring war against Japan. And that's part of the just cause. Now here's an example of a non-governmental authority, and it was the 9/11 terrorist. At around 9:30 p.m. on September 11, 2001, George Tenet, director of the CIA, told President Bush and U.S. senior officials that the CIA's Counterterrorism Center had determined that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. 2 weeks after 9/11, the FBI connected the hijackers to Al-Qaeda, a militant Salafist Islamist multinational organization. In other words, Al-Qaeda was not a legal government. It did not control a state, but it was a militant organization. So in this case, we would not be declaring war on any state, but we would be pursuing those terrorists without declaring war on a particular nation, as long as a nation was not responsible for supporting those terrorists. Principle number 3 is comparative justification. This third principle means this: by way of stark comparison, it should be apparent that the actions of the enemy are morally wrong, and the actions of the responding nation bringing the war are morally right. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. In this case, the good nation, this is talking about the good nation, is taking wrath on the wrongdoer, which is the evil actions by a nation, protecting, and the intent is to protect the citizens in that nation. So Japan was obviously in the wrong for a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and declaring war on the United States. So we, in turn, have declared war on Japan. And we are in the position of saying that we were morally right in protecting our citizens and also protecting those in the different islands that Japan was attacking. For instance, as Japan was attacking Pearl Harbor, they were also attacking Manila in the Philippines. And Japan was attacking many other nations out in the Pacific Ocean. Right intention is the purpose of the war to achieve justice and righteousness, or one of conquest, pillage, and destruction. Or perhaps the motives are vengeful. Carefully discerning whether the motives and intentions for going to war are just as critically important. This discernment can only be accomplished through the counsel of many. It follows then that a nation should not unilaterally wage war by its executive. Rather, seeking congressional approval would be supported by Scripture. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. So, example of right intention. In the War of 1812, the United States took on the greatest naval power in the world, Great Britain, in a conflict that would have an immense impact on the young country's future. Causes of the war included British attempts to restrict U.S. trade, the Royal Navy's impressment of American seamen, and Britain's encouragement of Native American hostility against American expansion. So we declared war against Great Britain because Great Britain was warring against the United States. Our intention was to rid Great Britain of this harassment, and we went no further than stopping Great Britain from these naval engagements. Now, here is an example of revenge and conquest as I see it. I'm going to have to stop here and add a note. When we go into the next lesson and I talk about issues, some of the issues are whether or not we are getting the full, truthful story. And in every war, there is a great amount of deception and propaganda. So we have to be very cautious when we're assessing these situations, that we are discerning the truth from the different lies and propaganda. Now, I have gotten a lot of information off the internet on these historical accounts, and I have not done a deep study on these topics. So I may have some of the conclusions may not be accurate, but based on the information I present here, I'll say that the conclusion is accurate, pending verification or refute that the information is in error. So here is an example of the U.S. on revenge and conquest, as long as the information is accurate. So the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. Texas gained its independence from Mexico in 1836. Initially, The United States declined to incorporate it into the Union. Nonetheless, annexation procedures were quickly initiated after the 1844 election of Polk, who campaigned that Texas should be re-annexed and that the Oregon Territory should be reoccupied. Now, the reason these are in quotes is that Texas never belonged to the United States to begin with, so we were not re-annexing Texas nor reoccupying the Oregon Territory. Polk also had his eyes on California, New Mexico, and the rest of what is today the U.S. Southwest. When his offer to purchase those lands were rejected, he instigated a fight by moving troops into a disputed zone between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River, which had previously recognized as part of the Mexican state of Coahuila. So Polk sent troops, and this appears to be a unilateral decision as an executive to send troops in this disputed area, which provoked Mexico to counterattack. And then we were fighting for the Texas territory as well as the Southwest and Oregon over in this area of what is now the United States. Principle number 5, last resort. Have all the other reasonable means of resolving the conflict been seriously tried and exhausted? God is most pleased when parties can resolve their problems, thereby eliminating any need for war. At the same time, this principle is often misused by the wrongful party. Is the perpetrating nation using drawn-out negotiations as a stall tactic while they prepare to do evil? Some of the principles, insofar, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. And Deuteronomy 20:10-11, when you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. This is God instructing Israel to go up against the different nations that were in the promised land. So Israel is to go fight a city, but first it is to offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. That is not to kill those people, but to use them. They'll be basically become slaves for Israel. Let's see. And resolving conflict as a last resort, the Cuban Missile Crisis comes to as close as possible. The Cuban Missile Crisis comes to a close as Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agrees to remove Russian missiles from Cuba in exchange for a promise from the United States to respect Cuba's territorial sovereignty. So this was pushing almost to a nuclear crisis back in 1960, back in the early 1960s. I want to say early 63, but I could be mistaken on that. The one thing that caused this crisis, however, is that the United States with NATO had positioned nuclear-tipped missiles in Turkey aimed at Russia. Well, this provoked Russia to move nuclear missiles into Cuba. to be aimed at the United States. And that's what pushed us to this conflict. And it was resolved. It was resolved and taking a look at resolving the conflict as the last resort. And it was done properly. A delaying tactic. September 29th, 1938, just 2 days before the deadline, Hitler agreed to meet in Munich with Chamberlain, Italian leader Mussolini, and French Premier Daladier to discuss a diplomatic resolution to the crisis. The four leaders, without any input from Czechoslovakia in the negotiation, agreed to cede the Sudetenland to Hitler. Chamberlain also separately drafted a non-aggression pact between Britain and Germany that Hitler signed. When news of the diplomatic breakthrough reached the British capital, normally stayed London responded like a death row prisoner granted a last-minute reprieve. Jubilation and waves of relief washed over London in a celebration that had not been seen since the armistice of World War I. So Germany had attacked the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and this brought in these diplomatic negotiations. And they gave the land that Germany conquered to Germany, but Chamberlain bought into the lie of Hitler with this peace agreement that they signed, which lasted until 1939 when Germany went and attacked Poland. But this was allowing Hitler to buy time to better prepare for his military engagements through World War II. And principle number 6, probability of success. It is foolish to enter into a war unless there is a high probability of success. Oh, what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000. This comes out of Luke 14:31. And we're looking at Czechoslovakia again. The occupation of Sudetenland, the border regions in the north and west of Czechoslovakia, was the first time Hitler flexed his military muscles in Europe. The region was conceded to Germany by the Czech government in an attempt to avoid war after the Germans made demands for it to be handed over. For Hitler, this fulfilled two aims. One was to unite German-speaking people of this region with Germany, supporting his goal of a larger united German nation. This kind of sounds like Putin invading Ukraine, going after the Russian-speaking people on the eastern portion of Ukraine, doesn't it? And the other was that it let him test how far he could push other European powers who backed down rather than defend Czechoslovakia from German threats. So here the Western powers backed down and allowed Germany to gain territory in a rather evil manner. And this is allowing Germany to test its strength against those Western powers and its resolve to continue their effort at world domination. Principle number 7, proportionality of results. will the good results stemming from the success of the war objectives be greater than the losses that will inevitably occur from pursuing the war? Even though God states that governments are to carry the sword to avenge wrath upon the one who practices evil, it doesn't always follow that the good achieved by avenging the evil is outweighed by the additional harm that could result to innocent bystanders. Perhaps the proportionality of results will increase with patience or further creativity manifest in the timing or type of war. So the last example of Czechoslovakia allowing Germany the Sudetenland instead of going to war follows this proportionality of results. Czechoslovakia apparently did not have the military power nor the will to fight for that lost territory. It was cheaper for them, weighing the potential losses, to let Germany have that land rather than go to war and fight for that land and have many, many Czechs killed in what would probably have been a lost war to begin with. For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, "This man began to build and was not able to finish." So here we had a situation called the Berlin airlift. And this is an example of proportionality of results. After World War II, the four Allied nations, which was the Soviet Union, United States, Great Britain, and France, split Germany up. The Soviet Union got eastern part of Germany, and you see the British zone and the West and the American zone and the French zone making up West Germany. In the middle of the Soviet zone was Berlin, and Berlin was also divided up into four parcels for the four nations. And what started happening, I think this was 1948 time period, is the British and the American and the French were looking at combining their separate territories into one Western Germany. And this was done pretty much in secret, without the Soviet Union being involved in the planning at all. Well, when the Soviets found out that there was a secret plan going on, they stopped all traffic flowing into Berlin from the Western German side. And basically, it began starving those residents within Berlin. So the United States and Great Britain enacted what was called the airlift. Instead of trying to cross the land with trucks and trains to get food into Berlin, the Americans and British were flying loads of food and provisions and airdropping them into Berlin. And this lasted a year until the Soviets gave in and allowed the food products and whatnot to go to Berlin again in normal fashion. And it was about the same time that the Soviets put up the Berlin Wall to keep East Germans from escaping into Berlin, into a safe zone. So this was proportionality of results. Instead of declaring war on the Soviet Union, we just found another way around their war fighting intentions. And the last of the 8 principles for justifying going to war is the right spirit. All war must be undertaken with great reluctance, sobriety, and counsel. Those who engage the force of war must do so with great sorrow. Given the pain of punishment, the inevitability of harming innocent people, and the overall further setbacks that will occur to the nation and its citizens, for any individual or nation to gleefully enter into combat is to be woefully displeasing to God. The right spirit, scatter the peoples who delight in war, meaning that we should not have people that delight in going to war. One of the things that we might be discussing next meeting is our neocons, and they do have a tendency to delight in war, and they have been quite prevalent the last 20 or 30 years. So that would be that can be a very interesting discussion, is those that delight in war. And 2 Samuel 5:17-19, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. But David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand?" And the Lord said to David, "Go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand." So this is going in with the right spirit. And David went in with the assurance from God that he will prevail. An example for us is the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume, among the powers of the earth, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separate. So with our Declaration of Independence, we weren't declaring war against Britain at the time, but we were entering knowing we were going to be going into war. Actually, war had already started. And we went in with the right spirit. And again, this spirit was based on the laws of nature and nature's God. So we're looking at the just war theory, and when the aforementioned criteria are carefully and corporately reasoned, and it is just and righteous to go to war, then a nation must engage with its full force, intense focus, and all-out power in a quest for immediate and decisive victory. In response to fulfillment of all the elements of the just war theory, when it is just and righteous to go to war, then the results can in no way be a half-hearted response, and must have clear objectives. And there's examples we could take a look at right now. As far as engaging with its full force, intense focus, and all-out power in a quest for immediate and decisive victory. And some examples may come to mind. We were in Afghanistan for what, 21 years? And it appeared that we did not go in with a full force, with an intense focus for decisive victory. Vietnam was also very similar. When I joined the Air Force, it was in 1974, and it was right at the tail end of our engagement with Vietnam. Then I had gone to, a few years later, another military school, and Vietnam was discussed as whether or not we had actually pursued war the way we should have. And basically, we did not pursue our engagement in Vietnam in accordance with this. We could take a look at Russia and its invasion into Ukraine. And you may ask if they went in with a full force, with an intense focus and all out power. It appears maybe not. But they also reacted very quickly with some threats that were coming from the West. So that may be a difficult judgment to make. But in no way should we enter into a military engagement with a half-hearted response. And we must have clear objectives. And we'll take a look later where for Afghanistan and Iraq, we did not have clear objectives that were rationally thought out. And that should make for some interesting discussion on Thursday. Now, going through those 8 principles and justifying going to war, we'll take a look at the 4 principles of fighting a war. Now, this is not for how to fight a war. This is for the principles of fighting a war. And this is part 2 of Capital Ministries Bible study on when war is justifiable. And again, I highly encourage you to jot this website down and go to it and make copies of part 1 and part 2 and read them for yourselves. These you're going to want to have for the debates that I heard Robin talking about, plus our position as sovereigns of this nation. We have to know what the just war theory is so that we can assess whether or not our servants, i.e., those that are elected into office, are doing the right thing or not. And the better that the voting citizens know their role as sovereigns and understand the just war theory, the better they can judge those that are elected into office and those that are running for office to be elected into office. And we need to be sure that those elected representatives are going to be doing the right thing, basically providing service to us in a more biblical manner than how we've been served up to now. So let's take a look at those 4 principles. Proportionality in the use of force, discrimination between combatants and non-combatants, avoidance of evil means, and good faith. Proportionality in the use of force. There should be no greater use of force during the war than is necessary to achieve the objectives. Deuteronomy 20, 11 to 15. If it accepts your offer of peace and opens its gates to you, all the people found in it will become forced laborers for you and serve you. We talked about that earlier. However, if it does not make peace with you, but wages war against you, lay siege to it. When the Lord your God hands it over to you, you must strike down all its males with the sword. But you may take the women, children, animals, and whatever else is in the city, all its spoil as plunder. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies that the Lord your God has given you. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are far away from you and are not among the cities of these nations. Now, these are very specific instructions God gave to Israel, and in other portions of the Bible, there's explanations for why there's the slaughter of every male and what to do with the spoil. And there are reasons. He is a just and righteous God, and he does provide reasons for what may appear to be excessive force. So what about atomic weapons? And this is the question of the day. I think such questions as these beg the real question, which is why war became so much more destructive in the first half of the 20th century than ever before in the history of our species. It did so, I believe, because efficient killing technologies made the traditional exercise of national sovereignty pathological. To quote the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the number of civilian deaths in Japan greatly exceeded the number of strictly military deaths inflicted on the Japanese in combat by the armed forces of the United States. This statement is pregnant with significance, for if there still be doubt that the emphasis in warfare has shifted from military forces to the civilian population, then this fact should dissipate all uncertainty. So what we're looking at in the first example is that Israel, when it went up to cities to lay siege, they went up with a sufficient military force to force the city to either surrender or to take hold of the city and take the plunder and kill the combatants. And that was the traditional exercise of national sovereignty. But now, with the capability of delivering atomic weapons from great distances away, that's changed the environment a lot. And this is so what this is saying is that this particular principle really needs to be weighed in light of our modern technology. And we'll be taking a look at this again on Thursday, but we must be go back to this again. Excuse me. There should be no greater use of force during the war than is necessary to achieve the objectives. Excuse me. So basically, going into war with atomic weapons and killing masses of people is excessive force. Have to drink a little water there. An example of going in with a strong force but not excessive, excuse me, was in our Gulf War I, where George Bush I was the commander-in-chief, and we were chasing Saddam Hussein's Iraqis out of Kuwait. and we used carpet bombing. And the carpet bombing was used only against the Iraqi soldiers. But it was very effective carpet bombing, and the war was ended very, very quickly. That was one of the quickest wars that we had ever engaged in, where we had taken hold of the enemy with surrender. Discrimination between combatants and non-combatants. In the pursuit of war, appropriate consideration and care of non-combatants need occur. And again, the example of God directing David to enter enemy cities, to only kill the combatants, but to save the women and children and other plunder. When the Lord your God gives it in your hand, you shall strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword. Only the women and children and the animals and all that is in it, in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourself, and you shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols are international treaties that contain the most important rules limiting the barbarity of war. They protect people who do not take part in the fighting, such as the civilians, medics, air and aid workers, and those who can no longer fight, which are wounded, sick, and shipwrecked combatant soldiers. And I'm sorry, I can't read the very bottom line there. I have a little block here that
I think you can click the little hide.
Little hide.
Yeah, okay, you got it.
I was kind of nervous to do that because I didn't know if it was what it was gonna do. Okay, yeah, shipwrecked troops or prisoners of war. Thank you, John. So here we're looking at strategic bombing, often involved. Oh, let me go back. In the pursuit of appropriate consideration and care of non-combatants and need occur. And the Geneva Conventions, notice this is plural. The Geneva Convention system began in 1864. And as weaponry technology progressed, the Geneva Convention was modified. So there were a number of conventions that were coming out as wars were prosecuted and new technologies were causing greater casualties. So the Geneva Convention is playing catch up to the various wars. So in World War II, strategic bombing often involved bombing areas inhabited by civilians, and some campaigns were deliberately designed to target civilian populations in order to terrorize and disrupt their usual activities. International law at the outset of World War II, and we're talking about the Geneva Convention, did not specifically forbid aerial bombardment of cities, despite the prior occurrence of such bombing during World War I, Spanish-American War, and the Second Sino-Japanese War. And in those periods, the size of the bombs and the bombers, actually the smaller airplanes, were minimal, so it couldn't cause the havoc that the strategic bombers could do in World War II with their larger loads of bombs. So strategic bombing during World War II began on 1 September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the Luftwaffe began bombing cities and civilian population in Poland. in an indiscriminate aerial bombardment campaign. As the war continued to expand, bombing by both the Axis and the Allies increased significantly. The RAF began bombing Germany in March 1940. In September 1940, the Luftwaffe began targeting British cities in the Blitz. After the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Luftwaffe attacked Soviet cities and infrastructure. From 1942 onward, the British bombing campaign against Germany became less restrictive and increasingly targeted industrial sites and eventually civilian areas. So what was happening is, though enemy combatants were being targeted, the efforts were being escalated. Germany first did it, followed by the Allies that were countering Germany's example. And the effort just escalated to where many thousands of civilians were indiscriminately killed with these bombing raids. And that violated just war principle of not killing the non-combatants. The bombing of Germany, 1940 to 45. In World War II, approximately 410,000 German civilians were killed by Allied air raids. In Hamburg alone, about 49,000 civilians were killed by Allied bombing, and in Berlin, about 35,000. During a single attack carried out at night from February 1st to the 14th, more than 20,000 civilians were killed in Dresden. But not only cities had fallen victim to the Allies' strategic bombing. The medium-sized town of Nordhausen lost about 20,000 of its population in one night attack in 1945. Pforzheim lost 22%. Numerous cities, medium-sized towns, and small towns had been the target of the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Air Force amongst them. So again, over 400,000 German civilians were killed. And not like manner, there weren't as many British civilians killed in the bombings of London. And obviously, we didn't have any bombings in the United States. So our civilian population was well protected. The atomic bomb was the culmination of that trend, a mechanism that visited total death upon its targets, cheaply, indiscriminately, and almost instantaneously. Whether or not people died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki depended not on their identities, whether combatants or non-combatants, Korean forced laborers, American prisoners of war, pregnant women, children, grandmothers, newborn babies, or Shinto priests, but merely on the accident of their distance from ground zero that day. Now, there are a couple things that provoked our use of the atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that's not well understood or not well known. One is leaflets were dropped prior to the bombings, warning everybody to evacuate the area, that their cities will be destroyed. It didn't say how they're going to be destroyed. It just says the cities will be destroyed. But with the Tokyo fire bombings and the devastation of Tokyo, it was well understood that human life will not survive in those type of attacks remaining in the city. And it was told, or as a story goes that I've been told recently, is that the United States intelligence had picked up that the American POWs that Japan had were all going to be slaughtered. And this had provoked Truman then to allow the nuclear bomb attacks onto Hiroshima. And since Japan did not surrender after that, they dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. And then Japan surrendered. But war is hell. And unfortunately, these principles were put aside to fight the war. Avoidance of evil means depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. So there are two areas here to discuss. One is the international humanitarian law. It governs the choice of weapons and prohibits or restricts the use of certain weapons. The International Committee of the Red Cross plays a leading role in the promotion and development of law regulating the use of weapons. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols are, and we already talked about this one at the last time, are international treaties that contain the most important rules limiting the barbarity of war. They protect people who do not take part in fighting, which is the civilians, medics, and aid workers, and those who can no longer fight, wounded, sick, shipwrecked troops, prisoners of war. So in this first example, both of these international laws come about after these certain weapons have been used in war. Because up until that time, those weapons were not used and they were not well known to be prohibiting. So, for instance, in World War I, mustard gas was used, but it was not outlawed until afterwards, as I understand it. And so there's rules and regulations on what weapons can be used and not used. The bioweapons, they are outlawed, but you have to ask the question, why are the different countries still working on bioweapons? And that is going to be a pernicious problem, I believe. And we got the Geneva Conventions, and we'll find out why sometimes these conventions do not work, and it's based on worldviews. The 1864 Geneva Convention stipulated that wounded men who fell into enemy hands should be provided with medical care. The 1899 and 1907 Hague Convention set out that prisoners of war should be treated humanely and outlined a range of regulations intended to standardize prisoner treatment and protect captives from abuses. Yet, what actually happened at the moment of surrender, the extent to which surrender was accepted, or how often men surrendering were shot out of hand, remains one of the least researched or indeed researchable aspects of the Great War. On all of the war's fronts, there were many cases of quarter being refused to surrendering soldiers. This has been, and quarter is housing. This has been little studied, and what research has been done relates to the Western Front, where prisoner killing at capture appears to have occurred on all sides. So even though there was the Geneva Convention, it was violated in World War I under these circumstances. And taking a look, World War II. German POWs held by the British. 0.3% of German POWs died in captivity. Going down here at the very bottom, Soviet POWs held by the Germans. Almost 58% of the Soviet captured military died in prison. in German war camps. German POWs held by the Americans, 0.15%. American POWs held by the Germans, 1.2%. German POWs held by the French, less than 3%. British POWs held by Germans, a little over 3%. German POWs held by the Czechs, 5%. Now recall that Czechoslovakia was the first country attacked. They ended up not fighting Germany, but giving the Sudetenland to Germany. Yet there was no revenge taken on the German prisoners held by the Czechs. British POWs held by the Japanese, 25%. German POWs held by Eastern Europeans, 33%. That would be the Polish, primarily the Polish and those areas that Germany had attacked. So there was a lot of revenge taking place by the Eastern Europeans against the Germans. And the Japanese against the Americans, 33%. German POWs held by the Soviets. So the Soviets were, in turn, treating the German POWs almost as bad as the Germans treating the Soviet POWs. And German POWs held by the Yugoslavs, it was 41%. So, again, it depends on worldview, and those nations that are guided more strongly by the rule of law, those upheld the Geneva Convention much better than those that were pretty revengeful. Chemical warfare. It is a situation that cannot be described. Birds began falling from their nest, then other animals, then humans. It was total annihilation, said Kirwan. Whoever was able to walk out of town left on foot. Whoever had a car left by car. But whoever had too many children to carry on their shoulders, they stayed in the town and succumbed to the gas. Death toll estimates range from 3,200 to more than 7,000, in addition to the 10,000 who were injured in the massacre that became known as the Bloody Friday. Saddam Hussein's cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, who would come to be known as Chemical Ali for his role in the attacks, was heard on tape obtained by Human Rights Watch, addressing the ruling Ba'ath Party. I will kill them all with chemical weapons, he said of the Kurds, who is going to say anything. So again, we're looking at worldview, and we'll address this even further on Thursday. But chemical warfare, I mean, this happened just very recently. Chemical warfare had been banned, but yet we have nations that are storing the chemical products and using them. Following the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. Department of Justice issued secret opinions finding that waterboarding and other so-called enhanced interrogation techniques did not constitute torture. On the basis of the 2002 opinion, subsequently rescinded, it authorized the CIA to use such techniques against suspected terrorists held at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and in secret prisons in other countries. In 2002 to 2003, the CIA repeatedly waterboarded 3 captured members of Al-Qaeda, the Islamic terrorist organization responsible for the attacks. After the agency publicly confirmed its use of waterboarding in 2005, members of the Bush administration defended the technique as legal and necessary and insisted that it had yielded valuable intelligence regarding Al-Qaeda's membership and operations. So this is one of those issues, crossing a fine line, possibly. But it was the U.S. Department of Justice issuing a secret opinion, which should not have been secret. I don't believe it should have been well known, and then that would have allowed discussion, a worldwide discussion, which was necessary, since it's all part of a worldwide agreement of the Geneva Convention. And they rescinded it in 2005. So it would appear that it was rescinded because it was determined to be unauthorized or not legal. It was part of torture. And these are, again, there is no perfect nation. Worldviews are, there is no perfect biblical worldview. But the more that we are aware of our responsibility of sovereigns, the better we can hold our servants to toe the line. So this is avoidance of evil means. The fourth principle of fighting war is good faith. There must be a genuine, sincere desire going into and fighting any war that the nation desires to restore peace and live in harmony with the other nation, because it is an ultimate sense, even though the nation has done wrong. Once it is punished and humbled, forgiveness can be and should follow. Matthew 5:43, you have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. And here's an example of good faith. General Douglas MacArthur, after taking control of Japan, after Japan surrendered, he entered Japan. He entered Japan with two primary goals: eliminating Japan's war potential and turning it into a Western-style nation with pro-American orientation. He had full authority, almost unlimited power to accomplish these tasks. As the interim leader of Japan from 1945 to 48, he was responsible for confirming and enforcing sentences for Japan's war criminals and oversaw the rebuilding of the country, including drafting the country's new constitution and implementing major land reform initiatives. So here we dealt with Japan on good faith. And dealing in bad faith, if nothing else comes out of the Iraq War, it should banish the concept of nation building from our language and our minds. The track record of nation building and Wilsonian grandiosity ought to give anyone pause, as was said in this column before the Iraq War began. We can now add the track record of Iraq to the list of disasters. The very existence of Iraq is a result of Woodrow Wilson's grandiose ideas about the right of self-determination of peoples, which led to the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire by the victorious Allied powers after World War I. Some of the most bitter and intractable conflicts of our time have arisen in nations carved out of the Ottoman Empire, whether in the Balkans or the Middle East. You cannot turn a territory and its population into a functioning nation with the stroke of a pen or the drawing of lines on a map. Real nations evolve over time out of mutual accommodations of peoples, not imposing the bright ideas of theorists from the top down. And this is what we did to the Ottoman Empire when we defeated Germany and the Turks. So with this, let's see, what do I have to do to exit out of here now?
I believe you click that square with the arrow thing at the bottom.
Okay, there is no square with the arrow.
No, okay, hold on.
I think when I hit that hide.
Sorry, hide it away. I think Robin.
Oh, here.
Oh yeah. Okay, found it. Good.
Okay. Yeah, that was on another screen.
Okay.
All right. Well, I got through justification for war and the principles for engaging in war. So we could ask questions now, go through a Q&A session, and Thursday we'll have much more time for Q&A. So any questions at this time?
Anybody? That was a lot.
That's a lot of information, and like I said, to dig into it, I really, really encourage you to go to Capital Ministries. That's capmin.org, and download the part 1 and part 2, and you probably have to read it and reread it to really digest it and incorporate it into your thoughts.
Mr. Hawkins, I have a quick question about
Yes.
Geneva Convention. You say there's multiple agreement between the countries. What happened if one of the country or people who are not part of the Geneva Convention, assume that some country are not? What happened if they're violating any of the rule? What sort of power do they have to, give them, I don't know.
Well, Japan did not sign on to it during World War II. None of the Middle East have signed on to it. And with Japan, when they surrendered, that's when we set up the War Crimes Tribunal. And those that committed war crimes were punished accordingly. And that was the same thing that happened with Germany with the Nuremberg trials. That was taking the German officers and those that provoked the German war. They were taken to court, and many were hung or put into jail accordingly for their crimes. So there's really, it's an agreement, and during the war, there is no method of enforcing the agreement other than by the nation's own citizens. But the warring countries will have no authority at that time for forcing the other nation to abide by the agreements. So if a nation decides that they're not going to abide by the agreements, or they're going to violate this portion or that portion, it's their decision to do it, and there's nothing stopping them other than their own citizens or those that are in power that have a conscience to say, no, we can't do this.
Okay, thank you.
And in this day and age, and we'll take a look Thursday, it's going to be more and more difficult to enforce those provisions just because of the technologies that are out there. It's, we're aiming our ICBMs at Russia. Russia's aiming their ICBMs. I mean, we're assuming they're aiming their ICBMs at us. And so we'll be fighting a war from, 4,000 or 5,000 miles away.
I think, yeah, all these justifications and criteria presented give us tools to assess our just what we see in the news, and then the history and the application and the examples that you gave alongside each criteria really helped to help me to understand the whether the application,
Right.
and put it to like to reality. This is a real world test.
That we have, what that does is it provides basically the 12 principles I just went through, provides means of measuring what we're doing, means of measuring what other nations are doing. And then we have to understand that news is propaganda. And I think many will agree that with this COVID business, we saw a tremendous amount of propaganda. We're getting a lot of propaganda from the U.S. news about the Ukraine-Russian engagement. And it's interesting when you take a look at our independent news sources and those that are from around the world, there's somewhat of a different picture. And it's not all one-sided as we're led to believe. So it is very important when we know what to measure, and then to look for the different sources of news, try and weigh the truth from the propaganda, and then make a decision.
Yeah, and each nation has its reasons to put out different propaganda. We have a friend who's an international student from Japan, and the war was close to his heart, and he liked to talk to us about he would ask us what we have learned, because what we have learned is nothing like what he has learned back in Japan.
Exactly.
It made very interesting conversations when we had our talks together.
Yeah.
But he was very gracious. He's reserved, and he would ask us questions first. He wanted to learn from our perspective. So it was very educational.
Right, exactly. And the thing about wars is wars deplete our national resources, and wars make nations go into debt, big debt. And Nixon took us off the gold standard primarily because of the debt that was incurred through the Vietnam War, as well as the war on poverty that was started in 1965. But we went into heavy debt, and nations were cashing in the gold certificates that we were issuing for the gold that we had in Fort Knox. And so rather than being depleted totally of gold, Nixon took us off the gold standard to save the nation for a little bit longer. But this deal with debt is very treacherous, and it's heavily tied into wars and a war fighting machine.
Yeah. So I really would encourage our debaters to think through and review what you have heard tonight. Just even what Mr. Hawkins just mentioned now. This is a disadvantage. It could be, it's a harm when we're in different cases that you can consider as something to argue for against a case. So just all the implications involved. I really I feel like I want to watch this again now so I can review some of the applications. So, and it is getting late for Mr. Hawkins on the East Coast. So, really, does nobody has any questions? Don't be afraid to. I know sometimes it's hard to even frame your thought into a question. Yeah. So, Carl, Jesse, and Grace. Yeah. If not, if no one has any question, we will say goodbye. We will let Mr. Hulkin have his good night rest. Oh, there's a lot to think about. Yes, Shirley.
There is a tremendous amount to think about, and it is not an easy subject. And really, whenever you start investigating, if you want to spend time investigating this Ukraine-Russia thing, you need to have those principles printed out right in front of you and carefully go through each one as you are taking a look at the various news sources that you find, and trying to determine what's up, who's doing what to whom.
Yeah.
And is there only one evil and one good nation, or are they both evil, or what's going on?
Right.
And did Russia have a legitimate excuse for the invasion?
Mm.
And what was happening to the Russian-speaking Ukrainians by the former Nazi Ukrainians on the West Ukrainian side? Because there was a clash of ideologies between the Russian-speaking Ukrainians and the ones on the West side, which seemed to be tied to the former Nazi regime in World War II. At least some of them. They were wearing uniforms with a swastika on them. So there's a lot to look at. It's not an easy judgment.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I confess I don't watch and read a lot of news, and I don't know a lot of history. So John was telling me, I mean, just now we mentioned bioweapons is outlawed, and yet, nations are still developing them. And John pointed out some days ago recently that bioweapons was actually one of the reasons Russia gave in the UN for starting anything.
Right.
So, but of course, I think I would assume we would have denied that, we were developing weapons, but is that, yeah, so that lots to think about.
Yeah, and apparently the United States Department of Defense had a lot to do with those laboratories, labs that were in Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah, just as, I was surprised that when we mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis that you said we had missiles pointing at them in Turkey. I didn't know about that.
Yeah,
I know very little history. Yeah. So, yeah, but thank you. And I think, in debate too, we do ask our debaters to do research thoroughly, to really know and understand and evaluate the sources. So it's a big exercise, a lifelong habit that we hope to develop so that we can have discernment. Yeah, better discernment.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins.
Well, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. And I know it was a lot, but I hope that you do gain knowledge out of this, and actually going to those studies that CapMin put out, and then weighing the examples that were provided through the presentation here.
Yes. Yeah, this was very valuable, and we look forward to part 2 on Thursday.
Very good. Very good. Have your questions ready by then.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's a thank you note.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Kristen.
Yes. Okay. So so we will end the meeting now, and just so you know, on Thursday we're starting half an hour later at 6, and that is 8 9 p.m. Eastern time.
Okay, very good. And thank you, Shaylee. And
The Solomon.
yes. Okay. I guess
Okay.
it's time to say good night. Good night,
Yes.
everybody.
Good night,
Good
Mr.
night.
Hogan.
See you Thursday.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.